China is open for Africa to work with both China and the West. Actually, to do business, China indeed require a lot of other advanced economies to work together in Africa. Chinese businessmen always saying, let's make the cake bigger. Because currently Africa is full of chance. It's not a zero-sum game. China is certainly involved in the current debt burden, but China is not the major cause. The major cause is actually the hiking U.S. interest rate and the strong dollar, because this made all the global capital just going back to the U.S. and making the Africans difficult to get new capital, and also made a cost of borrowing to repay the old debt very difficult. BRI in Africa then is closely related to FOCAC, and they have this interesting mechanism of having small countries building up them together to express their common shared interests to China, and there are also more established communication and interaction system within this China-Africa partnership.
Welcome to Inside the China Room, your premier destination for insights into Chinese current events. I'm your host, Jiang. The 2024 Summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation will be held in Beijing from September the 4th to 6th, with the theme of joining hands to advance modernization and build a high-level China-Africa community with a shared future. The summit is expected to further deepen solidarity and cooperation between China and Africa. Over the past few years, the cooperation between China and Africa has also attracted more and more global attention, and I have always wanted to do a podcast on China-Africa relations. Today, we are joined by Professor Tang Xiaoyang from Tsinghua University. Professor Tang is a scholar specializing in China-Africa relations, China's engagement in the developing countries, and the globalization process. He currently serves as the chair in the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University and has a distinguished background that includes significant research on African agricultural development and China's role in shaping economic strategies across the continent. Professor Tang's academic journey is complemented by his practical experience, including consultancy roles with international organizations such as the World Bank and the United Nations. His deep understanding of both the theoretical and practical aspects of China-Africa cooperation has made him a sought-after voice in discussions on global development strategies. His recent commentary on the evolving dynamics of China-Africa relations, particularly in the context of the upcoming 2024 Summit for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, has been instrumental in shaping current discourse. In today's episode, Professor Tang will share his perspectives on the key issues of China-Africa relations, the Belt and Road Initiative, and South-South cooperation, and how geopolitics will influence the direction of China-Africa relations in the years to come.
Hello, Professor Tang. Welcome to Inside the China Room.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you.
I'm very happy to have you on my show today. Before we deep dive into our conversation about the China-Africa relations, can you first tell us a little bit more about your previous experience? I saw you started in the United States and Germany during your early years. What sparked your interest in China-Africa relations and motivated you to conduct research in this domain?
I studied philosophy in Germany and in New York. So my PhD is in pure theoretical philosophy on Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger. And actually during my study years, I also was doing some practical consulting since I had also a business undergraduate degree and did some work. So I wanted to combine practice with theory. And the China-Africa relationship was intriguing because I see it as a part of the global modernization process. Actually, the topic of development, it's so comprehensive that no single discipline can cover them completely. So you cannot just rely on economics, neither only on politics or anthropology or area studies. countries to understand the development challenges and their solutions. So actually, when I did the field research in Africa and see how the South-South cooperation going on, I find a lot of food for thought on the ground. And actually, this I think can be only better understood and also analyzed when you have a more interdisciplinary approach. So actually, I see this China-Africa engagement first put them in this South-South cooperation context, and further then put them in the trend of global modernization, and then try to understand this phenomenon rather from this broad background and also the very long history, and then using theories from philosophy, from political economy, and all different disciplines to understand them in depth.
I'm sure we'll touch the fruitful discoveries you just mentioned when you did the research in Africa. May I ask you, do you remember how many times you have been to Africa?
Okay, this is also difficult to count. Before the pandemic, actually, I went there very often and every year. So I think sometimes dozens of times, even during a year in multiple countries, sometimes a long stay up to like 3 months, and sometimes just a very quick visit for overnight conference. So I have covered maybe more than 30 African countries, and for some of them very multiple times and long stay.
After the pandemic, have you ever been back to the Africa continent?
Yeah, last year I went back to Ethiopia and to DRC. This year I still have planned to go to South Africa, but it will be in the fall.
I'm sure we would also talk about that, the people-to-people exchanges between Africa and China later. But first of all, we know that the 2024 summit for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is scheduled for early December. In your opinion, what key aspects are likely to be the focus of attention for both China and Africa during this forum?
I think for this time, the discussion on the quality of the bilateral cooperation will be the focus. As we know, the global economic situation is quite challenging, and especially this high interest rate and a very strong dollar that made the investments into Africa and developing countries quite difficult. So in that moment, then we cannot use the methods during last decades when we invest a lot into large scale infrastructures. So we need to find a new way to more efficiently use the money and try to improve the return of this limited investment. Together with the rise of renewable energy sector and also digital technology, and I think both sides may try to work together to find some new breakthroughs with the new technology and innovative approach.
You mentioned about that in the next 10 years, we might see some new changes in terms of the way of the cooperation and investment of China in the Africa. We'll also touch a little bit more later. In 2023, China-Africa trade reached 282.1 billion US dollars, with China maintaining its position as Africa's largest trading partner for the 15th consecutive year. According to your observations, have there any significant changes in the structure of trade products between China and Africa in recent years?
I think in general, we say that Africa, they still export mainly the resource-based products, while China exports mainly industrial manufactured products. These are still in general the similar pattern. But I think then with the changing global economic structure, especially with the breakthrough in renewable energy and also in digital economy, we see export from Africa, then certainly the lithium, cobalt, and also the copper. These minerals related to the renewable energy sector, they are actually growing quite a lot. While I think the petrol, this is actually decreasing. That's also because China imports more petrol from maybe the Asia or the Eurasia part. And then from the manufactured exports from China to Africa, we also see some change because the machinery and older traditional vehicles for engineering, maybe these are reducing a little bit, while the electric vehicles and also the telecom, more digital equipment, these are increasing.
I'm just wondering because the Chinese electric vehicles are very popular nowadays, right? It draws lots of tensions overseas. And some people, as you just mentioned, you also talk about the Chinese EVs exported in the African continent. But some people might be wondering that does the African continent has enough battery charging stations to support the popularity of the Chinese electric vehicles?
Yes, certainly infrastructure facilities are bottlenecks for any kinds of vehicles in Africa. Actually, in Africa, the traditional fossil fuel cars, they also have problem of even having gas. So sometimes they need to wait hours long in front of the gas stations. So in that connection, then even when there are not enough like these recharging stations in Africa, but actually this disadvantage is not so big because Africa also have problem of importing petrol and also having the gas in them into gas stations. So therefore sometimes like the Africans, they have hydro dams or they have some local power plants. This helps them to overcome the shortage of foreign exchange and to avoid the problem of importing petrols. So they are even more willing to using these local electricities, sometimes even from solar power, from wind power, to recharge their cars, even when there are not enough recharging stations. But as long as there's such a possibility, it's already a benefit for them, because otherwise when they want to wait for the foreign exchange and wait for the import of petrol, that may take even longer.
I see. Actually, just remind me that in our last episode, an expert was talking about use in China with me, and he mentioned that because he also studied in America, he noticed that the mobility ability of people actually can restrict people's development in terms of ensuring they receive like benefit, better opportunities. Because if people can move to each places in a more efficient and cheap way, then they will be able to get more opportunities. That is also something that helps Chinese people, like in rural places, they can use like cheap electric vehicles to other places in a more economical way. I don't know if you have find like similar phenomenon in Africa that the EVs popularity help the African people prove their mobility in a more economical way, thus helping them extend their life opportunities.
I would say the mobility and the opportunities related to the mobility, they should actually keep evolving in balanced way. Because when you have Africa, this current market and economic situation, you also don't need excessive mobility, because sometimes the road congestion and also the lack of paved roads and also lack of jobs in the cities as well as the underdeveloped markets, this all limited the effects of mobility. So therefore for Africa currently, their major challenge is to have the mobility, like have basic mechanical mobility. Unlike in China, you actually need maybe a more cost-effective mobility so that you can move more people more frequently between the urban and the village. In Africa, that's more like it's a competition between cars and foot, and your like traditional just by a physical power. So therefore for Africa now, I think the electric vehicles and the traditional fossil fuel cars, they both can provide this kind of basic first step mechanical mobility. The difference is just when you want the fossil fuel cars, then usually you only get the second-hand ones because they are relatively expensive. While for the EVs, then you cannot buy second-hand, is not very good. So therefore you usually have the first-hand, but if it's like Chinese made or sometimes even like assembled in Africa, then that's quite cheap. So the difference is rather you have a new car instead of a second-hand car, and sometimes it's you have a car with electricity, and instead of those who are waiting for imported petrol. So I think that for Africa's EV market, they are actually just emerging. It's still quite an early stage. I think its advantage is to overcome some of these problems related to import of petrols, but it certainly has also problem of electricity supply. So in Africa, a lot of countries, they have different problems. In some countries, the petrol import is a bottleneck, but in other countries, the electricity supply, that's a bottleneck. So that depends. And I do not see very large scale transformation at this moment, but it's rather some more fancy and experiment pilot consumers. They are willing to buy these EVs as to enjoy some of this new trend, but it's also not really a very general trend yet.
I believe it will take time, especially considering that, as you just mentioned, different countries have different conditions in Africa. And, in recent years, as you just said, the China-Africa cooperation has gone significant transformation, shifting from a primarily infrastructure investment to a focus on more environmentally friendly, sustainable, and human capital-oriented development. And the Africa Finance Corporation Chief Executive Samalia Zubalu said in May this year that China, as a world leader in renewable energy, should consider relocating part of the industry supply chain to Africa rather than viewing the continent merely as a source of raw materials. What is your opinion on this perspective? I believe you just mentioned that some Chinese electric vehicles actually can be assembled in the continent. Can you tell us more about that? And how do you think China can balance the development needs of African countries with China's own strategic objectives?
Yeah, so the industrialization is always a theme for China-Africa cooperation. So in fact, even in the traditional like extractive sectors, China has already spent a lot of efforts and investments in Africa to build refinery and processing facilities, such as the refineries in Sudan and also the cobalt processing zones in Zambia. And this trend is set to continue because China understands the need, the demands from Africa, like what you just mentioned, the AFC's views of increasing value added. However, to extend this value chain production, you need a lot of support, both hardware and software. For example, you need enough power supply, and you need the infrastructure facilities to guarantee this high intensity manufacturing production activities, as well as the labor scheme, etc. And also government policy, taxation policy, and import-export customs should all be helping these investors for their operations. So this is just about how this target is common, shared by both Chinese and Africans. But in terms of implementation and operation, then the investors, they have a say because they need to compete with the global market. You cannot just blame it for Chinese not willing to do that, because that's not just an aid, just a political action, but it should be put into the global competition and business platform. Therefore, both sides should make efforts together to realize this common target.
So, according to your observation, I believe like in the past 10 or 20 years, there are many people who want to do their business overseas. We call it the Chuhai, right? I mean, at the current stage, there are still some people who want to go to the Southeastern Asian countries or to the Africa continent. So what are their now investment goals or the sectors that are interested to invest in Africa countries nowadays comparing to like 10 years or 20 years ago, the Chinese businessmen? I'm sure you must have some friends.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, certainly in Africa, one thing is quite stay consistent, namely the investment in extractive sector, in natural resources. This is still the majority, but what I see the new trend is to have more investment to develop Africa's own market. So maybe 10 years ago, people was more interested in Africa's labor, saying, oh, they have cheap labor, maybe they can replace China as another labor-intensive manufacturing basis. But I think after 10 years, this aspect is actually decreasing because people find out in order to have this labor-intensive manufacturing, you need a lot of like foreign exchange and also need the import-export facilities and customs and policies. And also like you need the accessories. So a lot of supporting company suppliers along the value chain. And this is not yet ready in Africa for them to compete in the global market in this labor-intensive manufacturing. So therefore, indeed, a lot of these investors, they actually go to Southeast Asia and sometimes to Mexico, to Latin America to build this labor-intensive manufacturing. But in Africa, then they discover their own domestic or regional market are growing quite fast since Africa has a fast-growing population, which is also very young and a lot of potential. This market is largely neglected by the global multinational companies. So the Chinese investors, so 10 years, 20 years ago, they mainly exported the Chinese manufactured goods to these countries. But after like a decade of trade, they discover a lot of opportunities like in processed food and also in plastic, construction materials, digital equipment. They all find that there are a lot of consumer demands in these markets. So we see a lot of Chinese investors now building factories and setting up production bases in Africa to meet these domestic demands. Yeah, that's actually a very new trend.
And how does your businessman friends who invest in Africa comment or evaluate their current business environment? Like some people say that it's actually, well, to some extent, it's a gamble to invest in Africa because I believe the conditions vary from country to countries, right? I
Right.
mean, some people just say maybe you invest something, it has a great return, but because of the business environment, you are risking losing your company for different reasons. I mean, what was your friend's perspective on this issue, or do you have anything to say
Yeah.
about this issue?
Right. An investment is always a gamble all across the world. But in Africa, this gamble maybe means a high return, but accompanied with high risk. So for them, they see in Africa, since the market is largely neglected by the multinational companies, so they often see a vacuum in the market. So whatever products you give in, like sometimes it's outdated models, but still you can have quite good sales and quite a good margin. And but however, the risk is also very high since logistics and also the policy, especially the security situation, may very quickly worse, and this will even threaten the lives, let alone the property. But still, then there are different preference of businessmen. So I think for the Chinese businessmen, they are more willing than Western companies to invest in Africa because first they have less choice than their Western counterparts. Since these Western multinationals, they are already overwhelming in the global market, they can rather choose a more secured market, while the Chinese companies, then they face very fierce competition everywhere, and only in Africa, then maybe they see more opportunities. And another thing is Chinese businessmen, they experienced very rapid development from home. They know how China's market was like 20, 30 years ago. And currently, the African market looks for a lot of Chinese businessmen, just like China 30 years ago. So therefore, they are more confident. They said if we go there earlier and with our own efforts, maybe we can also enjoy the fruits like China today. So I think these two factors contribute to the Chinese business interests in Africa.
Yeah, I'm sure the past development or achievement China achieved can serve as an inspiration for many African countries. And speak of the trade between the two countries, how has the China-Africa economic and trade cooperation contributed to the internationalization of the renminbi?
At first, then in mainly the China-Africa trade today, they are still calculated in terms of dollars. And while the RMB, they are rather at some like central bank or more like in the financial sector internally. So as we know, China has so far like 3 RMB clearing centers in Africa, in Johannesburg, in Lusaka, Zambia, and also in Mauritius. And then we also see the RMBs like swamps between China and some African banks within Nigeria, with a handful of countries. Also, some African banks started to use the SIPs, so the Chinese transfer system like the SWIFT. But all this, they are not really like for the small and medium businesses, but rather for government level, central bank level, their clearance. And I think the major use of this strategy of RMB internationalization is first to secure this macro financial security. We know now the SWIFT and the US dollars, they actually are more and more weaponized by the US and the West as some geopolitical tension. So both China and African countries, they are very wary of this point. So they want to develop a stronger system, alternative system to in case this kind of situation when the US dollar or SWIFT weaponized. But beyond that, I think they are still very cautiously moving the RMB internationalization forward, because this is actually will take decades, if not century long work to change people's habits to accept this RMB as an international currency.
And you mentioned about the US weaponized the US dollars. I think previously you also mentioned that the policy directions of African countries and third parties like the United States will also greatly influence the future development of China and Africa relations. Can you discuss the changes with us about the relationship between African countries and the US and Europe in recent years? And how will geopolitics influence the direction of China-Africa relations in the years to come?
I think the US and Europe for the last decade, they became much more attentive to Africa, and they are turning their political attention to Africa's, but mainly to their relationship with China. This, to some extent, not a bad thing for Africa, since then they can get more aid, also more maybe policy preference from preferential policies from the West. But on the other hand, it's also not very pure intention for the West to work with Africa. They sometimes, like during the Trump administration, they even wanted African countries to pick side between the US and China. So this actually will put the African countries into some Cold War situation. But fortunately, most African countries rejected this kind of absurd policies from the Trump administration. And they said, we want to work with both sides. And I think China is also open for Africa to work with both China and the West. Actually, to do business, China indeed require a lot of other advanced economies to work together in Africa. Since Africa has such a vast continent and such a big market, but also very huge demand for the investments. China alone cannot monopolize this market. And Chinese businessmen has always saying, let's make the cake bigger, because currently Africa is full of chances. It's not a zero-sum game. So if we have more investors, more countries to work together in the continent to develop Africa bigger, then actually everybody can benefit from them. So this is China's position. Therefore, China would really welcome US or Europe to invest, to do business in Africa, but would reject this pig side, ridiculous policies. But for the last several years, I would say after Trump administration, the US also understood the stupidity of this pig side policy, and they are trying also to avoid it, and then they try to reduce their very clear target at China. They are now saying, we want to work together. To be honest, their real effort in investing Africa is not very concrete or materialized yet. So although they are talking a lot about the PGII, so the partnership for the global infrastructure, and also they talked about the Lobito corridor, so build out railway in Angola and Zambia and DRC, and the Europe talk about global gateway, but saw rather a lot of political gestures or MOUs around this initiative. But to be frankly, I haven't seen any projects implemented under these initiatives. So at least US and Europe, they should speed up their implementation, and so that the Africa can see some real projects.
Yeah, I definitely say that there will be some competitions. If we can say that competitions between China or between other countries, but I just mentioned that China actually welcomes cooperation because one country cannot help the African countries to develop to a very ideal stage. So in the next 10 years, because Belt and Road Initiative already has 10 years developments in the African countries, what was the biggest lessons that China learned from the Belt and Road Initiative projects in African countries? And how does the BRI projects in African countries serve China's global PRI projects in terms of the lessons, significance? Because I was posted in Pakistan for China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was hailed as the flagship project of the BRI. But actually, we know that there are many projects also in other countries, in other regions, like in the Southeastern Asian countries or in African countries. So I'm just curious about in China's strategies, the BR projects in different regions should have different characteristics, and how does them serve the whole project's progress and the strategies in the next 10 years?
Yeah, so in Africa, they had originally already this FOCAC partnership. At the beginning, BRI, they only covered a small part of Africa. And only after, I think, 2017, and later then when the BRI, they are no longer limited to the geographic countries, but also open to all those who accept the BRI spirit. I think so far, 52 out of 54 African countries, they signed BRI-related MOUs with China. So in this connection, then BRI and FOCAC, they can hardly be divided. They actually just come hand in hand. Therefore, then the one characteristic or uniqueness in Africa's BRI is exactly in addition to BRI, they also already have the FOCAC. So a lot of the so-called BRI project are actually also included in the FOCAC. So we can see the FOCAC partnership means the whole continent, they have more coordinated or orchestrated agreement with China on industrialization, on the modernization and education. Because Africa, their characteristic is a relatively fragmented market and the political map. So every country is relatively small. Therefore, if you just for a small country to work with China, this giant, maybe this will cause imbalance situation. But as a continent, then you will also make these small African countries, also their views are more sufficiently expressed through this partnership. Therefore, I think BRI in Africa then is closely related to FOCAC, and they have this interesting mechanism of having small countries building up them together to express their common shared interests to China, and there are also more established communication and interaction system within China-Africa partnership. Unlike BRI in other places, you are building from the scratch, and while China has already this FOCAC partnership for more than 20 years, so therefore the minister level visit and meetings and how they come together to check the progress and solve the problem, they already have very clear steps. And I think with the BRI's new addition, you just have more new resources and more political attention and ideas. For example, previously the African leaders only came for the FOCAC meeting, but now African leaders, also quite a few of them, joined the BRI meetings, right? So this increased the chance of communication. And I think in the spirit of BRI, then we see China build two major railways in Africa. One is Nairobi-Mombasa Railway, the other is Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway. These two railways, they are also quite symbolic for the China's global BRI engagement, because this exactly fits to the spirit of facility connection and also the financial coordination, and then it increased a lot of people-to-people exchange, and then help the trade and investment. And so all the BRI's idea of increasing connectivity and enhancing the connection and improving trade and economic. So I think like monumental projects in Addis Ababa and Djibouti and Nairobi, Mombasa actually celebrated as representatives of this BRI spirits.
You mentioned about the benefits of different mechanisms like the BRR or the FOCAC, which can actually serve the benefits of both the African countries and China. We also know that we have the BRICS, and there are some new members joining the BRICS now. We have like Egypt and Ethiopia joined it. Now we have actually 3 African countries being part of the BRICS. What new opportunities do you think this expansion presents for the China-African cooperation?
I think the BRICS, it's also a relatively new international structure, especially with the BRICS Plus, these newly joined members. The whole world is still waiting and observing how this BRICS Plus can really work. I would say this BRICS Plus and the BRI and then the FOCAC, they are very closely related, right? They all like represent interests of South-South cooperation, and then to provide more opportunities, more perspectives to the South-South cooperation. While FOCAC, that's more like a geographically defined bilateral mechanism. Then BRI, as we said, it's no longer geographically defined, but more like an idea-guided mechanism in the South-South, but it's mainly between China and other countries. While BRICS then looks more like a multilateral platform, although they haven't really established a very tight alliance or the institutional form, but major developing countries, they have the opportunity to gather together and then to express their concerns and maybe also work something for the global south, for the global development. I think that's the main in vision for the BRICS. So in that sense, then these three members, and perhaps we will have even more African members joining BRICS Plus. This means also to really add African perspectives to voice their concerns and to play a role in the global development multilateral platform. So since we know Africa is the continent with the most developing countries in the world, views are particularly important for development. So I think that's why we will have more African countries joining BRICS so that their perspectives can be heard more often and they can play much more important roles in the future.
And let's talk about the so-called debt trap. There are voices in international public opinion suggesting that China's investment in Africa constitute a debt trap. In your opinion, is there a direct link between African countries' debt issues and China's investments?
The debt trap, first, that's a fully unjustified, ungrounded term, because the debt trap means China is lending in order to take some assets from these countries. In terms of current debt distress and debt burden, then to partly China, because it takes about 20% of Africa's total debt. So that's certain, since China is helping, lending a lot to support Africa's infrastructure during last 2 decades. Therefore, China is certainly involved in the current debt burden and distress. But China is not the major cause. The major cause is actually the hiking US interest rate and the strong dollar, because this made the whole capital, all global capital, just going back to the US and making the Africans difficult to get new capital, and also made a cost of borrowing like new money to repay the older debt very difficult. In this situation, then quite a few African countries faced repayment challenges, some even defaulted. In some countries like Zambia or Ethiopia, China has the major shares in countries' debt. So when they defaulted, China is also a part of this debt commission and tried to work with other creditors together to solve these debt problems for these African countries.
We know that in July, China just released its freshest reform plans after the third plenary session. I'm sure you have read that resolution. Is there any content in that resolution, that reform plan, that you believe is particularly important for the future of China-Africa cooperation?
Yeah, in third plenary resolution, the major points are still focusing on China's own economy. And I think there's only one paragraph mentioning international economic cooperation. And under that paragraph, there you only have one sentence talking about the Belt and Road and how to further improve the quality of Belt and Road. So this one maybe is particularly related to the external economic cooperation with developing countries. However, the other parts, even when they just talk about China's own economy, they may have impacts on the China-Africa cooperation. Since a major idea from this third plenary is about this new equality productive force, right, to stress the quality and to emphasize innovation. So all this means the Chinese economy, they will go towards the direction of more innovation and more technology. And with that, this will also change a lot of China-Africa cooperation models and across the board. So from agriculture, from natural resources to manufacturing to digital telecommunication, you will see more technology will be applied to the cooperation. Actually, we already see something happening during last several years. For example, the biotechnology companies, they are investing in Africa and trying to select the best like a rice variety for African context by using gene biotechnology. And some logistic companies, they are actually using the new latest technology to preserve, transport African avocados and to import these avocados to China to supply the Chinese market. So these are all the things, and then as mentioned, this extractive sectors, maybe they will move more towards renewable energy minerals instead of traditional, and digital economy certainly will further grow. And already quite a few Chinese internet companies, e-commerce companies, they are entering Africa. So this all can be the future trend. I believe China-Africa cooperation will be more technology featured and more targeted at the quality improvement, and then will increase their efficiency and productivity.
Earlier, we discussed about the people-to-people exchanges. After pandemic, how has the people-to-people exchanges between China and Africa recovered or improved, according to our observation?
I think after the pandemic, to be honest, the Chinese overseas tourism is not recovering as fast as expected. So the same is also for Chinese tourism to Africa. We see some tourists going back to see safaris, but not many. And the African students and also Chinese businessmen, they are recovering more quickly. And most of African students, they are still eager to study in China. China is now the second destination for African students studying abroad after France. And Chinese businessmen now looking at Africa with more interest. And since the market situation within China and in the West so optimistic, then they have to find a new space to grow. So these are the two parts which are driving now more people-to-people exchange. And the new trend is maybe this digital platforms. They are building new channels for people-to-people exchange. I think that TikTok is also quite popular in Africa, and we also see quite a few African stars in Chinese internet, the Weibo. Yeah, so this actually increase some people-to-people exchange through this virtual platform.
The KOL from Africa, they are displayed their talents on Chinese versions of TikTok.
Right.
That's actually brought lots of Chinese people's attention to Africa. Okay, great. And we invite each of our guests to recommend a book or a movie or a travel destination in China to our international listeners and readers. What do you have for us today, Professor Tang?
Yeah, if possible, may I just recommend my own book on co-evolutionary pragmatism?
Sure.
Right, this book, it's in English and the Chinese version is coming next week.
Okay.
Yeah,
When
right.
did you finish the book? Writing the book?
I finished writing the book 2020. So the English one was published 2020, but the Chinese translation is just coming out now. And the reason why I recommend that book, because on the one hand, it has a subtitle called The Impact and Approach of China-Africa Economic Cooperation. So it's timely, and also with a lot of case studies, you can see this China-Africa cooperation in details, and it's a result over 12 years field work in Africa and China. On the other hand, the book has a theoretical framework which may help you understand not only China-Africa, but also China's own development, but also the global modernization process. Theoretically, I actually situated this China-Africa under a much broader and longer world history context. So you will see why development is such a big challenge change. That's not as people often just point out of doing the finger pointing game, saying, it's the government, it's the corrupted officials or infrastructure. But it's indeed actually a transformation of first of the global society's ideas, their vision. The whole global societies, when they changed their vision, then you will start to make the corresponding societal and also political and cultural transformations. So actually at the beginning, I talked a lot about how this vision and how this transformation can be initiated. So yeah, I really want people to see the interesting stories, but also to talk more about this development as a thought-provoking process. And I would love to have comments or have discussions if you find that book interesting.
Can you say again the full name of the book?
Sure. The full name is Co-Evolutionary Pragmatism, the Approach and the Impact of China-Africa Economic Cooperation.
Got it. So anyone, if you're interested in learning about like the fruitful achievements and results and the vision and also the transformation of the society, all these variable stuff, you can check out this book. We'll also put a link of the book's Amazon link into our newsletters and our podcast introductions. And definitely check it out. I'm also very interested to read that. Thank you very much, Professor Tang. Thank you very much for sharing so many insights and great thoughts about the China-Africa relations. Very happy to have you today. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Inside the China Room podcast. For cooperation, investing, or feedback, you can email me directly at jjiang.sisu@hotmail.com. Alternatively, please consider leaving a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Substack. If you find our podcast helpful, we would be delighted if you recommend it to others. See you next time and take care.